All right, good afternoon. I am here at the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma with Rodney Factor, tribal band chief of one of the 12 tribal bands of the nation, and Jake Tiger, a historian of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Welcome. How are you guys?
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
I appreciate you guys taking the time to speak with me today. We'll get right to it. I am here because I have a long-lasting fascination with the history and the culture of Native Americans, and given it's my show, I wanted to take the time and come to the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and speak with you guys. I will let you guys start and introduce yourselves, and we'll start with you, Rodney. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm Rodney Factor. Like you said, I'm one of the band chiefs of one of the largest bands of the Seminole Nation, Tusekia band. We're Oconee people, and I've been interested in our history, for a number of years. And I guess since I was about 18, I started reading about, Seminoles, and history books and different things like that. And of course, I grew up here with my people, and I learned from my elders, and I've been involved with our political system probably for the last a little over 25 years, and I've served in different capacities as a council representative and of course as a band chief or assistant band chief for the last 20 years. And at one time I even served as a temporary chair for the general council. But
Wow.
The nation has been, my basic interest, all these years.
Great. Thank you. Jake?
So what I do, I'm the historian. I work for the Historic and Cultural Preservation for the Seminole Nation. My title is the Cultural Technician. So mostly what I do outreach, work with the communities, mostly just try to educate people, get the right story out there. So I do a lot of work with museums, a lot of media, and in my other job I do acting as well, acting and modeling.
It's great.
And so I do that. Rodney said he's part of a band. I belong to the Tom Palmer Band. It's
Okay.
another traditional band that we have. I'm also Bear Clan. And I've just been, being Seminole, it just comes natural with me. I've been around Rodney all my life, and my grandfather, they were always together, so I was always with them, just learning from them, taking all their knowledge in. So that's how I got interested in doing all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see different generations together, and you just mentioned that your grandfather were friends and you've grown up around him. How much of that impacts the Native? That is a huge part of the Native American culture, correct? Of your culture. How much does that impact your upbringing?
So for me, I didn't really think of it as like mentoring. I thought it was just fun. I get to hang out with my grandpa and be around all the elders. But once he passed, then when he passed away 4 years ago, then I realized, somebody has to finish off his work. So I kind of dedicated myself to doing that and make sure everything's done in the right way. That we do a good deed or good justice for our people. So it was a pretty good positive upbringing, having good role models in my circle.
That's great. And Rodney, do you feel that as a responsibility to pass on the history and the culture to the next generation, as Jake's grandfather, or you may be doing so as a mentor or mentoring them?
Yeah, I feel that's important, to us now. I see a lot of our young people that are more assimilated, with the mainstream, in life, and a lot of them no longer have those values, that were taught to us by our elders, that generation above me with that, with that Seminole worldview, they view the world in a different way. And I like to share, as much as I can, those things that I learned from that generation above me, because those guys, we used to call them those old guys, but that generation, they shared with us, and they were in touch with that one above them, and so our history, isn't that long since our removal, and their memories went back to the times, of their grandfathers and the stories that were told to them, and that they shared with us is that this is the way we do things, you know. And I was brought up in a household like that, where, you know, they taught me, you know, well, you know, we do it like this or we do it like that, you know. And to me, I just thought everybody, you know, that's the way everybody, you know, was brought up. And till later on, you know, the more I got involved, the more I realized that, you know, that wasn't so, you know, that people had a different outlook on things than the way some of us did. And but yeah, it's always a pleasure for me to share, you know, those things that I learned that was shared with me, you know, and in hopes that it will spark something in someone, their interest or something, to maybe do more studying, more research, you know, on different things that wasn't available to me growing up or to some of the others. Because when I grew up and was interested, then there was no internet or anything like that, you know, for me to, you know, get information. I had to go to the libraries, you know, anything I picked up that I saw the word Seminole or something, you know, was of interest to me, and I'd read it, you know, and then reread it, you know, and try to understand it. And then later on I realized that everything that's written isn't, you know, necessarily true either, you know, and that I realized that there were other authors that did more in-depth research and, you know, before they published something, and some just copied off of others, you know. But yeah, and but so yeah, that interest has always been with me, and I guess it still is, because there's not a day that goes by that's not constantly a part of my life, you know. I mean, it's something that I'm always thinking about, you know, our struggles that, you know, we go through today, you know, and those things that happened yesterday, you know, years ago. And I see a lot of difference, you know, when I was growing up, you know. For instance, we had to carry water, you know. We didn't have running water in our homes, you know. We had to draw from a water well and carry buckets of water to our house, you know. And a lot of times, you know, when I was a small kid, you know, we used kerosene lamps for lighting, you know. There was no electric, there was no TVs or anything like that, you know. And that's how we grew up, you know. And it was just a part of life. And you know, later on, you know, we realized, well, not everybody grew up that way either, you know. They didn't know, you know, the value of water, you know, and when we say, you know, to us, the water is a valuable commodity, you know, and we respect it, you know. I know my grandmother used to be real particular about wasting water, you know, and she would say that, you know, don't waste that water, you know, if you're gonna. And we had buckets and a dipper in there, you know, to drink out of. You know, we'd dip water out to drink, and some of the kids, you know, sometimes would drink some of it, you know, and toss it out, you know. And then she would say, if you get that much water out, you drink all of it, you know, don't be wasting it, you know. But it was a real valued commodity like it is today, you know. But then it had a different meaning. And like I said, I didn't realize those things until I got older, how scarce water was to, you know, to them, because there were times, you know, when that water wasn't there, you know, and they had to travel miles to, you know, to haul water back to wherever they lived. But yeah, that struggle, you know, is, and I'm glad that I was a part of it, you know, because it, you know, it taught me things. And like I said, I was fortunate to have known that generation above me. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, a couple of things. There's so many questions that I have.
Right.
I want to come back to the removal of your people. And I do want to address, you know, one thing that I was kidding half that, you know, it's my show, so I want to talk about Native Americans because I'm interested in them. But I also do believe that this is, as you mentioned, this is a culture that with mainstream media, it's slowly fading. And it's not just, you know, the Seminole Nation, it's most indigenous cultures around the world with globalization and, you know, mass communication and, you know, mass commercialization. Those things are like, you know, it's blue jeans and rock and roll is the greatest, you know, commodity that, you know, America sold to the world. And it kind of took away from the care to preserve indigenous history for the new generations. On that note, that's why I think it's important to speak with Native American nations and, you know, people of different cultures. But on that note, I want to bring up again, I'm sure my grandparents, you know, every grandparent parents think it's important to pass on their history to the next generation. Why is it crucial, or why is it more so important for you guys, do you believe, to pass that story on or pass that culture on? The way, as you mentioned, the Seminole worldview. Why do you think it's crucial for you guys to pass it on, or do you not? I mean, do you think it's more important than others?
Oh yeah,
in that sense.
I believe so, because that's our identity. That's who we are. And now, to me, there's a lot of these young people, they're trying to be something that they're not.
Yeah.
And that's why they fall way behind. In certain areas. In life. But yeah, that's a part of our identity. And yeah, it should always be passed on, because that was part of the genocide that was committed against our people. It was our culture. Cultural genocide. That they wanted to destroy our language, they wanted to destroy our value system and those kind of things, and to bring us into the mainstream of those invaders that came here, that occupied our lands. And I think it's important that we as a people, always know where we came from and who we are, And but yeah, I think that's the most important thing for us as indigenous people, is to know those things and to relearn those values, along with our language and our culture, our traditions, to like I said, to identify, of who we are as a people.
And then going back to your identity, you mentioned the Seminole worldview. In a nutshell, what would each of you describe the Seminole worldview as?
Well, to me, it's the way we look at the world,
And what is that?
How we value nature, Mother Earth, and those things that were given to us, to live, those things that we hold dear, is the Creator, blessed us with, is water, clean air, food, medicines, and those kind of things, that come from the earth. Is that we value those things above money, and we try to preserve those things so that we can pass it down to those small children and those that have yet to be born. And I think that's our responsibilities, to do that, and to share the things that we have, and to get away from that greed, and get away from that hate that's in the world. Because when I was brought up, we were, that's the way we were taught, even as children, in living outside of indigenous community, in the homes, my grandparents and stuff, when, was introduced to I guess the outside society, from our home life, then my mother would tell us, if we had fruit, candy or something like that, and there was other kids out we were playing with and come in, and she would say, don't take that, out and eat in front of those other ones. She said, if you have enough to, share with everybody, then, it's all right. But if you don't, don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. And so we were taught to share, things, and not try to hoard things, but to share,
Right.
And so I think that's, that's a value, that's been bestowed upon us, and that comes from the indigenous world,
And what do you think the value of that to be passed on, or to be, like, that weights on you, kind of on your shoulders now, right?
Yeah, so like I said, the value of just natural resources, that's going to make a really big role, especially now with the coming about climate change. I never, it's always been this clash of cultures from the European worldview, when they brought to us and told us what we thought was wrong.
Yeah.
And
they do that everywhere.
Yeah, so they come here and tell us, what you're doing is wrong, you should listen to us. Well, look where we're at now. And so, to me, I've always valued having clean water. I was always more impressed by people who can identify edible plants in the woods, make a fire with their own bare hands, build a shelter. If I see someone with a college diploma, that doesn't excite me, because that doesn't connect to me. That wasn't here. And so I think it's very crucial to teach the next generation about that, the sustainable way of life that we had. So we had everything figured out. There was zero waste. There was nothing of that. We were very respectful of our resources. the land, the water, four-legged all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It all worked in just the perfect system.
Yeah.
And I think it's time we actually get back to that of being sustainable, reclaiming our language. That's the stuff that we really need to tighten on and really put that onto our next generation.
So thank you for that. I want to then go back to you saying that we need to go back to some of the old ways, and you mentioned the removal of your people. Let's go back. The Seminole Nation, the Seminole people, were not originally from Oklahoma. Tell me about their history.
So actually, let's take it back even further than that.
Okay.
So when we say the Seminole Nation, Rodney and I always talk about this. We're not a tribe. We're actually a nation of smaller tribes. So that's what we had bands. And those bands were their own tribes at one time. And so we're kind of a mixture of different tribal nations from that area. Most people were Muskogee, Miccosukee, Hitchiti, Chiaha, and descendants of those ancient tribes from Florida, the Calusa, Temecula people, those types of tribes, the Apalachicola. So those.
How many tribes in total? Or about?
We had more bands. 150 years ago, we had more bands, and most of them either died off or intertwined with other bands.
So just to clarify for our audience, define bands.
Bands are actually tribes. There was a number of smaller tribes that lived in that area around Georgia, Alabama, Florida, around they have that state line now, but in that same area, there was a number of small bands that lived there. Muskogee people came into that area, and they had their original towns or bands that came with them, and they were all kind of one people. But when they did, then those number of the smaller tribes around there, they became a part of that, like a confederacy, and they were all associated by fire, their ceremonies and stuff. Then that showed a type of relationship with them, and because of the European encroachment, then some of those tribes started to move into Georgia, because a lot of the original tribes that were in Florida at that time were disseminated by, or they were all, they succumbed to disease, war, and they tried to, started enslaving people. There were, thousands of people, that perished, over a period of time, and so some of those tribes, like mine, for instance, Oconee people were. Historians put them in north central Georgia, and they came into Florida, and that group of Oconees were the first to be known as Seminoles. I think in 1771, then there was an a meeting, and that name went down on, official documents as Seminoles, and they were referring to those people there that lived in that area, Oconees and their offshoots. There were others that came into Florida along the peninsula earlier, before the Oconee people came in. But when the Oconee people came in and settled around what's Gainesville today, then they became known as Seminoles. And a little bit later, not much later, but all of the the Florida tribes became known as Seminoles under that heading. And each one had its own form of government that were all similar. They had a chief, a band chief, then they had other officers, that, was a part of that too, their organization. Each one of them did. And, so they had, and their main thing was their identity, and that's what we struggle for today, to maintain that, is identity. And they knew who they were, where they come from. Their ceremonies, they simply wanted to be left alone, and they'd govern themselves, and, that struggle has gone on for over 500 years, and we still, resist, someone coming in and trying to tell us, what to do, how to run our government, and stuff. Yeah.
You mentioned that you both mentioned that there were multiple, up to 150 or more, different bands making the Seminole Nation. and that name didn't come, well, it wasn't created until the 1700s,
Yeah.
late 1700s.
Yeah, so the word Seminole is actually a corruption of a Spanish word, the Cimarrones. The British didn't know how to pronounce it, so they just said Seminoles.
So the name actually is not from your heritage.
No, it's
Okay.
from British. British didn't know how to speak Spanish, so they said Seminoles.
British bastardization
Well,
of
there's,
a
you know, you
Spanish word.
can, you read, and of course, you know, in any history, you're going to see that name, you know, and there's different, you know, there's different sources that'll say it came from a different, you know, different areas, you know. Even they say that it was a Muskogee word, you know. In Muskogee, there's no R's in their language, you know, the sound R, you know, I mean, and, you know, it was like, you know, Seminoles, you know, similar to that, and, but like I said, you know, who knows where it really,
Who knows,
you know.
right? So tell me about, so how long have these bands lived there in the Georgia, Florida area?
They've been there since the beginning of time. So what they were, a lot of them were the mound builder people.
Okay.
Especially the Muskogee Seminoles that were here. They came from Okmulgee, Moundville, that area.
Okay.
They had, you know, they lived in permanent cities. We weren't like the Plains tribes. We weren't always traveling, following our food. We were permanent. We grew our own. We're mostly agricultural based people. We had permanent towns. So that kind of sets us. It makes us unique in our own way, that we had our own separate identity from what you would see in Montana or South Dakota, in that area, what those tribes were doing there.
So what was the lifestyle like for these bands prior to Europeans arriving here?
Peaceful. Mostly what it would have been was, so we follow a matrilineal, we're matrilineal based people.
Okay.
So when we're talking about bands or clans, we get that from our mothers.
All right.
So that's where we get our identity from, is from our moms. But we did have but men and women both had leadership roles in the community. A lot of the young men were out, you know, hunting food. The women would be at home maintaining homes, while the men would be out hunting, gathering, and maintaining the borders, basically. And so we had a traditional game called stickball, and that was a game that we played. It's kind of imagine lacrosse, but, you know, 100
I mean,
times tougher.
lacrosse is
Yeah.
it's a Native American game.
Yeah, but, you know, how they play it, we were a lot more rough than.
Sure.
It's probably the roughest game on the planet.
Oh yeah, it's a stickball.
Yeah.
Okay. I would have to definitely look into that. Is this similar to the same one that's played in Asia? Because there's a stickball game that's played in Southern Asia.
I haven't looked into that.
Yeah, I'm gonna look at. I definitely need to compare notes. Okay, that's so you mentioned. I want to ask this, and and I don't want to get away from our main focus, but you mentioned that life was peaceful. You mentioned that the life was based on nature, and it's very different from now. Many would argue that, and because you also mentioned maintaining borders, I've heard so many, often incorrect or ill-informed, that opinions that, well, no, the Europeans came and civilized these people, and they, before that they were just cutting each other's heads off, killing each other. They were living peacefully. The Europeans came and civilized them. What would you say to that? Because they would say, like, well, where's the proof of them living peacefully?
Yeah.
Well, they killed them all, so there's no proof. But what would you say to that?
So I would say to that, like I said, the stickball, that was a game of war. So that's how we settled disputes.
Okay.
And a lot of there's a big story talked about the Creeks, or Muskogee Creeks and the Choctaws, their big stickball game.
Okay.
That's how we settled disputes back then. Only men could play the game back then. Traditionally, now these young folks, they want to corrupt it and add women into the game, but it's actually a game of war. And so it's only for men to do that.
Okay. That's young people today.
Yeah, that's the ones, they didn't really grow up around that, but there's a big problem we have now is a lot of these young folks come in and, I mean, their heart's in the right place, but they just need to take their time and just listen to what we're saying.
Right. You also mentioned that you are a matriarchal society, or maternal lineage society. The European culture was absolutely opposite of that. How has it impacted your lives for the last 500 years on adapting and living in a westernized world while trying to maintain that maternal or matriarchal lineage and structure in your culture?
That was part mostly. To me, that brought about confusion, not with us, at that time, but maybe today, with younger people. I can't speak about how they feel or what they think, and when they look at those things and try to understand it. But we had systems, and some of them, they say were complex systems. We had civilizations that had risen and fallen, before Europeans ever set foot on this continent.
Yeah.
And of course, like you said, those things that they put out, that we were savage people, that we were raised, strictly for war, and those kind of things, is some of the lies that they put out today, And like I said, now history is, they're uncovering that these things existed, all of these mounds and stuff, these civilizations, that existed. And of course, you see, like on the History Channel, where they're saying, "Oh, it must have been aliens, that came down." They still don't want to, give
anything to not give you guys credit or give the actual people credit.
They still don't want to give indigenous people that credit, like in South America, Central America, where corn came from, and came to us, and we have our stories of how it came, and of course now, archaeologists, and those that study those areas, identify that that's where corn came, and that was a major commodity of ours, at that time, and it subsisted, our people, during times of famine, and other times, and those kind of things, medicines and stuff, that we had at that time, and when those people came, then of course with the some of their doctrines and stuff, if we didn't agree, our people didn't agree to become Christianized, then they, said it's all right to kill them, and take their land. And that's what they did. They started that policy of genocide, against us, because that we wouldn't bow down to that foreign religion. We had our own, and we still do today. And a lot of it was been maintained for us over these years, because up until 1978, when the Freedom of Religions Act was passed, then only then could we really practice ceremonies and stuff like that without the threat of imprisonment or going to jail, even though, we were the original people here when they came, but, we couldn't exercise our religion, and like I said, they try to destroy our language, by, rounding up our children and taking them to boarding schools, or residential schools, and they said that, they would punish them, for speaking, their language and stuff. And senators, I've seen comments where, senators had made at that time that we eradicate those things, their culture, their tradition, their language, and they'll no longer think as indigenous people, and that's why I said, that's the main thing for us, our identity. And so that's why a lot of that was stripped away. They wanted to assimilate us, as to what they were. They wanted to bury history, for the things that they did to our people, and but to me, they can't hide from the truth. The truth is coming out, and now more of them are starting, and I say more of them, those people that are in position, that try to bury those things, and corrupted even the history books, and when I was growing up as a kid, then I'd be sitting in a classroom at times, and when we were discussing history, and teacher was elaborating, on a massacre they called, and all these other little white kids that were sitting around, would start looking at me, and I was thinking, what's up with that, and even though, they would make me, feel kind of bad, that, when they would say, oh, they were just savages, they murdered women and children, and stuff like that. And I would think, it kind of, had me confused, because, even though I was a child, I couldn't still believe that, you know, in my own mind, you know. And like I said, you know, and but that's what they did, you know, and that's what they try to do now, you know. But like I said, you can't erase history. And when I was talking about the civilizations that have risen and fallen before they set foot here, you know, they're identifying those things, you know, not only in the Illinois, you know, some of the great mountains there, and the Mississippian culture that they call it, you know, then all across the southeast, you know, and into the west in Mexico and South America, you know, that shows that, you know, that those things were, you know, going on at that time when Europeans were still living in caves.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Mike, I'm Bengali from Bangladesh, and we have a 4,000-year-old language. And my grandma said, like, you know, I need to go into America, but remember, when they were still living in caves and hanging in trees, we had built these cities, okay? So, and people forget that because they just, you know, rewrite the history books.
Right.
And a couple of things I want to just touch on what you just said. That one, just the complete erasure of history.
Right.
And until I came to the United States, Native Americans were never called savages. Like, that wasn't the word that, you know, equated to that. Because the Indians that we knew were the country over, we knew them as Indians. And because everyone called North American or South American Indians incorrectly, we called them Red Indians. That was the name that was given to us. But there was no ever violent or negative connotation to any of the attributes that were given to them. They were just like the original Americans, Red Indians of America. So it's funny how when I came here where they live, they're like, okay, well, you know, I heard there were savages or massacres. Those were not things that you hear on the other side of the world. I just wanted to say that. And secondly, you mentioned about sending kids to boarding schools. It's funny how our culture is changing today, and I've gotten into arguments with plenty of people about this, so I want to clarify from you guys. They talk about if a white girl wears a Pocahontas costume, that's appropriating culture. And I'm like, I'm not sure how many Native Americans are really pissed off if a young girl is wearing a Pocahontas costume. What's appropriating culture is that you took a bunch of these kids, Native American kids, and put them in Christian schools and dressed them up in little suits and, you know, shirts and pants. How is that not appropriating culture? So I want to hear from your opinions, because I get in these arguments all the time. How pissed are you guys actually about little girls wearing Native American costumes or Pocahontas costumes compared to the actual appropriation of culture that happened to your generation, your people for generations?
Well, that even goes into a bigger topic about people appropriating our culture.
Yeah.
You know, someone, you know, dresses as an Indian princess for Halloween.
Yeah.
That even goes even deeper, because that's romanticizing Native culture, sexualizing our women.
Okay.
That's why we have a big problem right now with the missing, murdered Indigenous women stuff going on.
Okay.
And Native women are actually the highest rate of being sexually assaulted, killed, and here in the United States.
Yeah.
Because of that, because all these people come out here, they want to romanticize us, think we're some kind of, like, you know, fairy tale creatures or whatever, and they think we're just a thing of the past and we're still here. So the audacity of them to strip us away from our culture and then to wear what we have, that's infuriating to me.
So personally, you are upset about.
Absolutely.
You are, okay. All right. Do you feel it was also cultural appropriation when it was done to you guys on the other way around, making you dress and look white and European?
Honestly, that was cultural genocide.
Okay.
You know, they told us we couldn't be ourselves. What we were doing was wrong.
Right.
And that kind of goes into, we kind of skipped over this, but that conflict between our cultures. That's why we went to war with the United States.
Right.
And in the early 1800s, for the Seminoles at least. I mean, nobody wants to go to war. It's not fun. Nobody wants to go, you know, take another life. But we knew our inherent right from the Creator that what we knew was right, and they were telling us what we were doing is wrong. So we're trying to protect that identity, going out there and trying to maintain that as much as possible. And And so we went to war in the United States. They call it the Seminole, the 3 Seminole Wars. Actually called the Seminole Wars. To this day, it's still the longest lasting war in the United States.
Yeah.
It went on for 29 years.
Yeah.
And so there was so much, how to say, upbringing. So we got a lot of our warriors came about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've never been famous, so we never went to war with the United States.
Yeah.
It wasn't, I don't like to glorify them as much, but I like to glorify their ideas, what they were fighting for.
Of course.
Absolutely. And so that's where the coming about the Indian Removal Act, signed by Andrew Jackson, that manifests destiny that, this white god.
Who is still actually on our money,
Yeah.
on our bills, which is mind blowing.
Yeah, and our last president had him hang up in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And so, these Christians think they're the center of the universe. That they come here and they think, everything's theirs. They're entitled to everything.
Yeah.
So they come up with this manifest destiny that said, their God's telling them, take as much as you want. That's
Well, what Israel is doing to Palestine right now.
absolutely.
Just settle them there, and they'll have to be removed.
Yeah.
And so, we weren't taught that way. We were taught to respect others. No matter what the color of your skin was, if you were, if you're straight or gay, whatever, respect them because they're people as well. And so we didn't, think that was the right way.
Mm-hmm.
And so there came about a lot of conflicts, and then, them telling us what we're doing is wrong. So that's when we go into the wars and the removal. So when that happened, so there was 2 treaties, the Treaty of Payne's Landing and the Treaty of Fort Gibson.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the 2 removal treaties. One was signed in 1832, and Payne's Landing, I believe, was 1833. And so the Seminoles, we actually came here in different sections.
Yeah.
We all didn't come here all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're still at war with the United States all the way until 1858. And so we started out at Florida, and the story of our removal is a lot more gruesome than the other 5 tribes.
Okay.
Because a lot of our men were brought here as prisoners of war. They brought us on old slave ships from Florida. They stacked us all like sardines in there, tightly packed, inhumane conditions. And our men were brought here in chains and shackles as literal prisoners of war. And they put us in these inhumane conditions where they were holding rations from us, clothing and blankets. And so we were put on ships, brought here to, one stop was Fort Pike, Louisiana, in New Orleans. They were held there for a while, and then they went up through the Arkansas, Illinois River, all the way up to Fort Smith, Arkansas. That was another stop. Most of them either had to march or go along the with the ships. But that's what people call the Trail of Tears now.
Yeah.
So after the Fort Smith, we had our permanent.
That was along with the Cherokees, correct?
Yeah. Well,
Fort
Smith was Arkansas. Then we were placed into Fort Gibson.
Gotcha. I know the Trail of Tears. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that I have my.
Yeah, the Cherokees like to call it the Trail of Tears.
Well, probably the Trail of Tears, but you guys were also part of that before or after the Cherokees, or was it simultaneous?
This is simultaneous.
Simultaneous.
But
you're saying that this was the worst ones because you guys were part of the Seminole Wars.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was all 5 tribes: Chickasaws, Muskogee Creeks, Seminoles, and Choctaws and Cherokees. We were all part of that. The first tribes that actually were moved from their homeland.
But were the Seminoles the only ones in the war?
Yeah, we were the most reluctant from removal. We wanted to stay in our homelands. Some of the other tribes actually did it willingly.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say who because I don't want to piss a lot of people off. But yeah, we were the most resilient to
Something we have in common.
Yeah.
When the British came over and colonized our in the subcontinent for 200 years, Bengalis were the last ones to fall because we were the only ones. To the right, the Myanmar gave up, Pakistanis gave up, Indians were subdued, and gave up. Bengalis were the last one to fall because we were just like, no, we just did not want that. And then, but because of it, we got the worst reaction for it because we fought the war the longest. and then the outcome was devastating. And it was cultural genocide.
Yeah, and we were the smallest group out of all
Yeah.
those 5 tribes.
Yeah, exactly.
And we actually made the United States the laughingstock around the world.
Yeah.
You know, if you talk to anybody about the fiercest warriors that ever lived, Seminoles will be on that list. And it's still to this day when you talk about Osceola. You know,
What is the Osceola?
Osceola is one of our warriors. He was
Okay.
our chief. He was
I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
he was a prominent leader because he went by that, you know, that traditional way of life and protecting our people and making sure we were safe and that our way of life would still continue.
When was he around?
1830s.
1830s. Before I definitely want to take a deeper dive into the conditions of the Trail of Tears for you guys and for your ancestors and coming here. Before that, I want to paint a picture of what the Seminole War was and why it was fought, because it seems pretty horrific thing to treat treat prisoners of war that way, to enslave them, to remove them. Today, no one would have to understand why that would be done. So it could be easily thought like, oh, they must have done these savages must have done something horrible,
Yeah.
right? I want to clarify that. Why was the Seminole Wars fought? What was the motive? You said that you respected the goals of the war. What were their goals? Why was it fought? And what happened during the wars?
I'll let you take that one, Rod.
Well, it goes back to where their original locations were when Europeans first arrived and started contact with those tribes. And like I said, mine was tribe is documented that they were in north central Georgia. And with the encroachment of Europeans coming in, and other things going on at the time, and some wars started, they were fighting, then they were moving from that conflict, and legend says that at one time they were in Florida and had moved up north, and so some of it says they were going back, to those areas that were vacated because of all of those that had perished there through disease and warfare, those other tribes there. And so they went back into that area, and some of the other tribes around that border started coming into that area for the same thing, to get away from the encroachment of the Europeans.
So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
The disease and the warfare, just to clarify, this is post-European arrival,
It was, yeah.
not prior to it.
Yeah, but when the Europeans arrived, then it was shortly after that's when people just started dying. People
Gotcha.
that didn't even see them, hadn't even seen them yet, but they were carrying, like now, with this pandemic, then people carried it from one village to another.
Yeah.
And a lot of them had never even set eyes on the Europeans, but yet their towns, they were dying, because of the diseases and stuff. Their immune system wasn't set up for that, and so there was a lot of areas that were vacant. And Spain also was trying to get, some of the indigenous nations to move in that area to buffer them, from the British, and so they did, and they moved into those areas, and they
Why
started.
would they?
Huh?
Why did they? Why would the other people move into those areas?
Well, it's where where Spain had been at war with Britain and all of that, and all of them were claiming, supposedly the New World,
Right.
different countries, and Spain, had Florida and all the way, back around through Louisiana and that area, and French were up north, claiming those areas, and the English or the British, were kind of in that center there, coming in with those colonies, claiming that area. And as more and more people came in and they started expanding, they needed more land, for their food, and those kind of things. And,
Gotcha.
and the trees, they say that a squirrel could go from the East Coast to the Mississippi River without touching the ground. The trees, the big oaks were so thick, and they say when Europeans came that the only thing they saw was money, and they start cutting those trees, to build ships and all of that stuff, and enslaving people, indigenous people at that time, to as slaves. But as they went into Florida, and there was, some peace at that time with those that, later became known as Seminoles. They prospered, they grew crops, and they had raised animals at that time. You know, they had started, you know, bringing in cattle, you know, and so they started, you know, possessing cattle and stuff like that. And so there was a little peace between that time, but the Europeans kept, you know, wanting more, encroaching, you know, and they used that as an excuse, you know, well, you know, they're, you know, depredations, you know, they're coming on to, you know, like across the border, they're taking our cattle, they're taking our horses, you know, blaming it on indigenous people, you know, trying to get support, you know, so that they could do what they wanted to do at that time. And like I said, our people had, you know, their own conflict. The Muskogee Creeks, you know, they had entered into a civil conflict at that time, you know, and drove a lot of their, you know, a lot of their people came into Florida, you know, and called Red Sticks, you know, came in and they joined in with the Seminoles in their resistance, you know, to removal. And of course, Andrew Jackson that Jake mentioned earlier, you know, he was a indigenous hater. And
that guy.
yeah, and he wanted to, you know, strip them of all their land east of the Mississippi. So they devised ways to do that, and even Congress, you know, that didn't pass, you know, like some might have thought it was unanimous, but it wasn't. You know, there's a lot of people, I think, finally started siding with indigenous people. You know, they were, you know, apt to just, you know, leave them be, you know, and some of them, you know, you can make treaties with them, you know, and those things, but there was others that wanted to do it by conquest, you know, to drive them, you know, east. And so whenever our war started, the first Seminole War, they claim, it came about because of encroachment, you know, and complaints of depredations that were made from our people, Seminole people. Also at that time, they had brought in Africans, you know, and started enslaving them there, you know, in their plantations and stuff. And a lot of them, you know, because that was still Spain, considered Spain's country or territory, they escaped into Florida, you know, in those areas, and started, you know, associating with the tribes that were there, and they became, some of them, you know, our people, you know, had adopted, you know, more of slavery, but it wasn't like them. They lived in their own separate communities, and they were kind of like a sharecropper at that time. You know, they provided those things for the tribes that they lived by. You know, they helped, you know.
So like indentured servitude in a sense?
Right. And, you know, of course, our people grew corn, you know, and other things, squash, beans, you know, and stuff like that, and raised livestock. But they paid a tribute, you know, by where they grew, you know, where they lived and the things that they did, you know. So those people from Georgia and Alabama at that time were crossing into Seminole country, you know, to retrieve those escaped slaves, you know. And some of those that were already there that were associated with the Seminole people, you know, then, you know, they were friends, they were allies, you know. And some of them were considered slaves, you know, by some of the Seminoles, you know, not all of them. But that started that first conflict, and so where they invaded, and then the Second Seminole War came, where still the same thing. You know, they wanted more land. You know, they coveted the land that they were on, you know, and so they forced them into a reservation there inside of Florida.
And this is the American government?
Yes, that was right, you know, before the Second Seminole War, and they forced them into that reservation. It was Moultrie Creek Treaty, the first ones that Seminoles made with the Americans, you know, was in 1823. And so, you know, during that time, then there was still more demand for more land. And so they came with the ideal that, well, you know, we'll send them all west of the Mississippi. You know, we'll remove them from these lands, you know, and all of the native people, you know, east of the Mississippi would be removed. And so that's where they started that, and that's where that Trail of Tears started. They negotiated with all the tribes, the 5 tribes, in removal, and all of them were opposed to it. But like I said, you know, they were forced, you know. And the Seminoles, when they approached them, then they said, no, we agreed to this, you know, that, you know, as, you know, for 20 years, you know, we'd be here, and we're not removing or going to talk about it until that time is up. And they said, well, we have land set aside if y'all would, send a delegation to look at that land and see if it's suitable. So they sent 5 sub-chiefs, I think it was, to look at this land here in Oklahoma to see if it was something they might, entertain, and move. They by no means had any authority to agree to that. But when they were here at Fort Gibson, then there was another treaty reached, and that's where they said that those 5 chiefs agreed to move,
But under duress or under what conditions? You have no idea.
Yeah, under duress, and also they said the interpreter, who was a freedman or a black slave, that had been freed, was interpreting. And of course, they made it, desirable for those ex-slaves or those slaves, the black man, to come west to escape those slave hunters, from Georgia and all of those areas, And so when they went back to Florida and told the people, what had happened, and those other chiefs said no, and they told the federal government that they had no authority, to sign in our behalf. They didn't have that authority. They're just supposed to look at that land and come back and tell us, what it looked like, and if it was suitable. And so they said, no, we're not moving, And the Indian agent at that time tried to put those chiefs aside and said, well, we're not going to recognize you as chiefs. We're going to recognize these others over here.
That happens
and
around
still,
the world.
yeah, and still they refused to, to agree to move. They're saying that we didn't agree to that. And of course, they threatened with war, and our people with war, and our people responded. I think it was Osceola, that said, that you have guns and so have we. You have bullets and so have we. You have powder and so have we. You have men and so have we. And we're not going to leave until, the last drop of our blood, sinks in the ground, something to that effect. And so the war started, that resistance, and it wasn't only the federal government troops, but there were a lot of other tribes that they recruited to come against us too, to come into those areas against us. And they never was really truly successful, but they hounded our people day and night, and there was a policy that they came up with, and that policy was genocide, The generals there, Jessup being one of them, had said that, I think the only way that we're going to eradicate these people from this land is to exterminate them, So they had that policy of extermination, basically to wipe our people off the face of the earth, And so when our people were captured, in the battlefields, in other areas where they came up on our camps, then they were held and put in like a little concentration camp until they gathered enough of them, and then they were brought west. So they had no way of going back and gathering articles that they had or their possessions, or anything. It was just what they had on them, whenever they were captured, And they made it more attractive to the black man to come west. And Jessup had promised them that, whenever the Seminoles go west, then you'll get to go with them. You can go with them. And so to them, then, oh yeah, that's what they wanted, to get away from those slave catchers,
Right.
They're in Florida and Georgia. So they turned against our people, some of them, and started showing them where they were camped, in those areas, acting as scouts for them.
And these are friends of the Seminole people
Yeah,
for so long that you've helped.
Yeah, they were supposed to be allies, but like I said, they made it more attractive to
had their own
them,
incentives.
to come west. And of course, they were looking out for their own interest. They didn't want to go back into slavery after experiencing all of that freedom. So that's kind of what happened. And slowly over those years, then they captured our leaders. Osceola was captured under a flag of truce. The top chief at that time that went under the term Miganuppa, and 5 sub-chiefs were captured under a flag of truce, in 1837, and they were brought west, with their people. They would, keep them at those forts and threaten to hang them, if their bands didn't come in, and those kind of things. So it was done under treachery, most of that, where they captured our most influential leaders. And so most of our chiefs and medicine people came west, and Billy Bowlegs being one of the last ones, that came, that they enticed him to come west after the so-called Third Seminole War,
The Third Seminole War was just a group of rugged, stubborn Seminoles that did not want to give up,
Right.
and they kept fighting. Correct?
Yeah, they were still, they retreated into some of those areas that were inaccessible to the soldiers and stuff, or they didn't know how to get in and get in there, and they stayed there, and I think there was pretty much like a ceasefire agreement, and there were surveyors that had went into that area and came into one of Billy Bowlegs' camps and cut down some banana trees that he had there. They cut down some of those trees, and so what they did then was then they refused to apologize, so that started the third conflict, that they referred to as the Third Seminole War.
Sorry, so you're finishing with the Third Seminole War.
Yeah, and they, like I said, they enticed him to come in, and he was one of the last ones to come in, and they had talked to, over the years, different influential leaders to go back to Florida and try to, talk to those others to come west to join them, and also Billy Bowlegs, they sent him back,
Who is Billy Bowlegs for our audience?
Billy Bowlegs came out of that Oconee group, that I had referred to before, out of that family, Obodamiko is what, they called him at that time, and he went under that, American title, Billy Bowlegs. But he was part of that, they referred to like a rural family, that provided leadership for the Oconee people all of those years, because it wasn't elections, it was hereditary,
Right.
And he was a part of that family, and whenever they were capturing people, then they wasn't distinguished by this one belongs to this band and that belongs to that band. They were bringing them all in together, and of those that were able to escape, and find refuge further into the swamps, they were a mixture of all of them, But Billy Bowlegs, being from that, in that hereditary line of being a chief, then he became a chief there, and led that fraction there at that time. And and so, whenever he came, then of course a lot of them came, then they had been living down there a number of years with those titles, and leading those people, their people and stuff. Then whenever they came here, they were set up like in a different band, recognized in a different band, because they didn't want to give up their, their title and go under another chief, But yeah, that was, Billy Bowlegs. And of course, as time went on, then, there was more, I guess, reporting from newspapers and things like that. Then his name became, quite common at that time. Right.
Gotcha. I have two quick questions before I move forward, because we do have a few more topics to cover, and I know we are limited on time. So just for clarification, the Seminole government, the way it worked, it was hereditary, not a elected government in the people.
Right.
Two, what, well, actually, let me just stay on that for a second. How would that work? So a child of a family would move on and take a leadership role?
It was usually the chief that they recognized as a chief. It was usually his sister's child.
Oh, okay.
So they kept it in that clanship, that he was still the same
Gotcha.
clan.
So it doesn't have to be the same family,
Right.
it doesn't like exact immediate family.
Yeah.
It can be, okay, nice.
Yeah, and
Well,
then,
that's
they married their, like a head chief might have his sisters married out to an influential person of another tribe or another band.
Gotcha.
And that solidified that unity with them, Yeah, so, that went on like that. Their kinship, the way that went.
That's great. Thank you for clarifying that, and that's very interesting. I also want to ask about the idea of slavery. So your ancestors, did they accept the escaped slaves, as allies, or were they slaves now that can live with them as slaves as well? Like, or was it pretty open based on what they wanted to bring into the table, or how was that
Well,
classified?
from my understanding and reading history, like I said, some of them were considered slaves that they purchased,
Gotcha.
That's part, I guess, part of that becoming assimilated, even then, that
Did you have slavery in your culture prior to the Europeans?
I understand there was, yes.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, that they purchased some as slaves, and then some of those that came in were recognized as free people,
Understood.
Yeah, so there was different, different ones, and some of them, married. There was some intermarriage, not that much, but there were some, and their children were considered, free.
Is that how the 800 black Seminoles were brought over here? Understood. Now, actually, let's go back to you, Jake, about that. You were telling me about the process, the Trail of Tears, and the horrendous conditions that the Seminoles were in as so-called prisoners of war.
Yeah.
No modern prisoner of war would understand the conditions that the Seminoles and other Native Americans might have faced post-war. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I kind of cut you off and went back to the source of the war. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? And afterwards, I also want to talk about that's mostly men, right? Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about how the women and the children were later brought over. If you can start with the prisoners of war.
Yeah, so like I said, the men, most of them were the warriors, so they were just, they had just got back from fighting, for their lives and for their families and for their people. And so there was a really big, I would say, animosity towards the Seminoles. Because like I said, we fought the hardest. The United States actually spent the most money fighting us, millions of dollars back then, fighting against, the smallest, really small nation. We made them become a laughingstock of the world.
Right.
And so the men were brought here on chains and shackles. Actually, there's some on display at the museum. I'll show you later. That were original shackles. And so we were brought here on old slave ships, and then later had march to here to Fort Gibson, and even go along other waterways. But I said we were withheld rations. We were just not treated as people. They were just wanted to exterminate us as much as they could. And that even happened on afterwards when we got here to Oklahoma or Indian Territory to Fort Gibson, withholding rations and withholding blankets and that kind of stuff. And so we were here in Fort Gibson until we got our actual independence. Because we were placed, they wanted to place us under the Muskogee Creek Nation, and we didn't want to be subjugated to that.
Of course.
We wanted to keep our own identity. So Fort Gibson area is actually a Cherokee territory, but we didn't want to, be with them because we actually fought against them in the wars too. A lot of other tribes served as scouts fighting against Seminoles too. So basically in the wars, Seminoles were fighting not just militias, volunteers, armies. We're fighting other tribal nations, other escaped slaves. So we didn't want to be a part of this Muskogee Creeks.
Right.
And so that's when they're talking about, bringing back Billy Bullock, trying to get him to come to an agreement. John Jumper, he was as part of Kawakaji. That was it was his cousin, right? Yeah, it's his cousin. John Jumper actually became the chief down here when we came to Indian Territory. And so we had all these negotiations about being a sovereign nation here in Indian Territory. And that happened until 1856. So the Seminoles were placed at Fort Gibson for at least about 15, 20 years in just the most inhumane conditions. But later we got the 1856 treaty where we became an independent sovereign nation, where we had to claim our own identity. They gave us our own light horse, which is our tribal police. We were given a council, our own lands, separate from the other 5 tribes.
Is this when you were given money as well for the land that was taken, or was the money? I believe it was a 16 million or 24 million that was given. to
That
the
was
people?
after.
Was it much later, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha, okay. Sorry.
Those are some of the same lands, but we wasn't given anything really, we inherited that as sovereign, as a sovereign nation. Those things were recognized at that time.
My apologies for
Yeah,
the terminology. But yeah, no, absolutely. It was take it from you.
Yeah.
The least they could do.
Yeah.
The absolute least
Yeah.
they could do.
And
Is
so,
that.
after we got our own independence, there was basically, if you look at the whole 19th century, there was really no peace for the Seminoles. Because we had to deal with war, removal, being placed in a territory that that still felt hostile to us.
And it wasn't yours.
Yeah, and then right after that, both sides we had to fight on both sides of the Civil War. We weren't really given a choice who to fight for. They just rounded us up and told us, if you want to keep your towns, your families, you're going to fight for us. So we had to fight on both sides.
So just based on if you lived a little up north or a little south,
Yeah.
you just fought each other, and it could be your own kin or your own people that you're fighting.
Yeah. So a lot of the Seminoles that fought for the Confederacy were under Stan Wade's regime. Stan Wade was a Cherokee general during the Civil War. He was actually the last Confederate general to surrender, actually, after the war. And so we had to deal with the Civil War. And then that time of Reconstruction, this whole area was just, communities were torn up, there was no infrastructure. And then shortly after that, we had to deal with the land runs, the Dawes Act, and those kind of stuff. The taking away of our lands. And so, like I said, the whole 19th century was just horrendous for us. There was no peaceful times, and there was some type of prosperity in the 20th century. We didn't actually get so we talk about hereditary chiefs. For a while, we had chiefs that were appointed by the President of the United States would actually appoint chiefs, so it wasn't duly elected by the people. The federal government would appoint them.
So complete disregard of your process that has lasted for thousands of years.
So later in 1969, we had our own constitution that had been ratified. We actually got to elect our chief finally. So that again, if you really look at the Seminoles, we're the most sovereign nation and on the whole entire planet, because our people actually get to have actual say-so of what actually happens within our government.
Thank you. Okay.
But, I think what's important is, that very fact that when the Civil War started, then our treaty, our treaties at that time, when we came here, we agreed with the federal government that we wouldn't be in any wars, with each other or anyone else, or against the United States. And the United States, in turn, agreed that, or, said that they would protect the nations, where we didn't have to worry about, going to war with anyone. So whenever the Confederacy started coming in to this area, then the Union troops all abandoned the forts and moved and left us defenseless.
Wow.
And we had emissaries then that went, and conferred with the United States, some of their officers, that under a treaty, under our treaty rights, then you're supposed to, protect us, and they didn't respond, so at that time, that's why some of the chiefs agreed to stay loyal and go toward Kansas, and some of the other chiefs, that were here, then what they looked at is that they're surrounded by the Confederate Army, and so the Confederacy offered a treaty that was better than what we have ever had before with the United States government, so they felt inclined to go along with that because their Confederate Army was all around them,
Right.
at that time, so they did, so whenever the war ended, and Seminoles said that, you're the ones that abrogated the treaty.
Yeah.
You agreed to offer us protection and you left. So we had to do what we had to do, basically, And the federal government says, no, you treated, you broke the treaty and signed in a treaty with the Confederate, so-called Confederate states. So, for that punishment, then, we want all of your land, to cede all of the land to cede back to them or sell back to them, So we bought, we were basically forced into that treaty, the 1866 treaty. And once we did that, then we bought our own land. I mean, they paid us so much an acre, and then we turn around and buy, the land that we occupy now for almost double, what they sold our land for, And so they put us in that predicament in this small county, So, and those were punishments of war, And actually, the president had the authority to do away with our treaties, at that time, and take land, under their laws. But he never did that,
Well, most treaties for the United States.
Yeah, it was those agents that they sent down here that lied, and because they had big plans, for the country, that they wanted, and so when they took our land there, then part of the reason they took it, they said for other tribes to move into those areas, that they were. Yeah. Oklahoma was basically a big reservation, that we're going to move other tribes into those areas that we occupied at one time before the Civil War. And then we're also going to remove those freed slaves into that area too, And so that's how that came about, But that's important to know that we've argued that, and we've always maintained it wasn't us that abrogated the treaty to start with. It was the federal government that did,
I mean, under which president was this?
That was it was Lincoln to start with, whenever it first started. Then, of course, after that, Johnson, after Lincoln's assassination, at the end of the Civil War,
I always wondered this. I mean, you see whenever, and this is kind of a bit off topic, but because you brought it up, you see so much television coverage of the U.S. presidents going to this nation, going to that nation. He's right now meeting with Putin, as he did a day ago, and he's at G7. Does the U.S. president take notion of your needs, and do they ever visit here?
No.
Do you guys want them to? Do you have any, intention of, them coming in to see, like you mentioned several problems that you guys face today. Do you want the U.S. government to take notice, and or the U.S. president to come see and visit you guys, meet with your leaders, or do you feel that because of what happened in the past, leave them out of it, we'll handle our own things?
I feel like they should actually really acknowledge us, because
Right.
they're making decisions on our behalf. They're occupying our land, so they should acknowledge not just Seminoles, but every tribal nation here in the continental United States.
Well, I think it would be great, for them to do that, from one nation to another,
Yeah.
Regardless of how small we are, we're still a nation.
Right.
That, occupied these lands, our ancestors occupied these lands, and our government, our former government was in existence before they ever came here. So yeah, I think that, that would be good, that acknowledge that, or give us a seat at the UN, or, give us a seat in Congress or something,
Right.
Where indigenous rights can be looked at, because every president, I don't care how much they say that this was a great president, Kennedy, all of them, that the American public sees as a great president, all came against us in some form or fashion, to strip us of our rights, And that's still happening today, and, that's gone on, that, like I said, all these presidents have, most of their policy has been against the native people. I think when Nixon, came into office, then in the 70s, then if you look at our history, indigenous history, then a lot of things came about at that time, like I said, the Freedom of Religion Act, 1978, Indian Child Welfare Act, self-determination, there's a lot of things that came about in the 70s, and it was, that was, part of Nixon's, term and stuff, and of course at that time the American Indian movement was born, and they started bringing these things out to the American public, and a lot of people said, they seen us as vanishing people, that, and a lot of them didn't even know how much of us, that really existed, But, like I said, the American Indian movement was one of the ones to bring that to the forefront, and started exposing these things that were going on. They were set to terminate a lot of our tribes at that time from federal recognition, and giving, federal help, federal aid, to different indigenous communities. And And once they were exposed, then there was a lot of people started supporting, indigenous rights at that time, and so that's how some of those major laws came about, that gave us back rights that we had before,
Now, it's mind-blowing to me that you guys, this is your land, you've been here, you're a nation, and yet our government and our senators and our president goes to other nations to visit them, but doesn't look at within.
Yeah.
In places like Australia or Canada, the indigenous people are recognized as the First Nations of the land, and they're given seats in their Congress and their Parliament. Why? How do you feel about that? What does that make you feel in being in the United States, supposedly the greatest country in the world, which I do believe it is, don't get me wrong, but the greatest country in the world, and not being recognized in the way that just your neighbors up north are doing to their indigenous people, or in the other side of the world, in Australia and in Asia, they're doing that to their indigenous people. How do you guys feel about that? Obviously nothing good, but how
I
does it
think
make you
that's,
feel?
why we continue to strive, and we continue to resist. And now, that a lot of these things are public, that they came against us, then those things have been exposed, and there's grants and stuff, monies are being made available to start restoring those things, not only with us, but within, indigenous communities and stuff. And of course, our health care has been bad, we've lived in poverty, like I was telling you earlier, where our people had to, carry water, haul water, and subsist on little things, food-wise, before they could get a job, their hair had to be cut, short
Right,
and
yeah.
stuff, and they had to pretty much assimilate, and I see that happening, and like you were naming some of the other countries, where colonialism exists, I'm also one of the board of directors for International Indian Treaty Council, and what we do, we look at human rights violations, we look at treaty rights violations, the right to food and those kind of things. And I've traveled with the organization down south in Guatemala and Mexico,
Wow.
and visited with some of their indigenous peoples there and the struggle that they're having there. And it's similar to what we've gone through, their assimilation-wise. A lot of them are losing their language, and most of them are all traditional people,
Right.
mining companies coming from America and Canada, coming in and doing strip mining, the government selling them out, for, monies, and declaring martial law against protesting, and
Right.
and actually killing those people for standing up and resisting, to try to preserve their land. They come in with that strip mining and pollute their water and stuff that they, get water, their water from, their drinking water, plants and stuff, these companies go in and they try to put a patent on the seeds that, they've grown traditionally all of these years, then they try to put a patent on their seeds and saying that, you can't grow that anymore, it's
Yeah.
against the law, you have to come to us and buy the seeds from us. Those kind of things, that they're imposing on themselves, and that's happening today, under disguise of giving them aid or something,
Yeah.
helping them, and that's here, with us in this, the United States, the so-called United States, but, like I said, those rocks are being overturned and they're being exposed, so a lot of these things are opening up the doors for us, and our people just have to take that initiative, and to continue to prosper, and Jake mentioned earlier that, there was a decision made called McGirt, the McGirt case just here about a year ago on July 9th, I think it was, and that recognized the reservation area for Muskogee Creeks. And here a few months ago, it was recognized with us too that we still have this reservation, that the borders it was never diminished, and so we still have the authority where, since Oklahoma's statehood, they've continued to encroach on us, persecuting our people and stuff, and they've done so illegally. And the United States Supreme Court has acknowledged that now,
Yeah.
that yes, they have, they have done us that way. persecuted our people. Like I said, they used our people for numbers and incarcerated them, in this, mass incarceration, those kind of things, and our people, like I said, they've suffered, in many different ways, with our health clinic, being inadequate, and those kind of things, but yeah, so, to me, as warriors, we come from a warrior society, basically, Jake kind of mentioned it a while ago, in our society, there in the East, and there was one they called like the red towns and the white towns, and the white towns were peace towns, they sued for peace, and they basically controlled government, during peacetime, but when war came, then it was the red towns that took over the strategy there. So they're the most well known now because it was war, that was documented, not so much as our peace times, but the war. So those war leaders are the ones that their names are in the history books and stuff, because that's where we came from. Here a few years ago, when Al Qaeda, became, started being named more and more, there was a general, had referred to that struggle, with the Seminoles, saying that, kind of equated us with Al Qaeda with the same things, and I said, and of course I came part of that organization. We were in New Mexico, Albuquerque, talking to the State Department, and I raised that issue, at that time, because that's when it had came out public, when I first heard about it, and of course, I was opposed to, them using that, because I said our people were freedom fighters,
Yeah.
They were fighting for their land, against invaders, and yet they acquainted us with Al Qaeda, over there, and they're the ones that were invading us, and they're the ones that are invading over there, sticking their nose in other people's business, you know. But yeah, they did that, and when I came back here, after I had read that, and I announced it at our band chiefs meeting, I brought it up, and told them those dates and stuff and what was said. And also we approached the principal chief, or the chief at that time, to write something in protest over that, that we don't appreciate them, using our name, as we were a terrorist organization or something, So see, those things still go on.
I'll start with you, Jake. You mentioned actually, Rodney, you mentioned a lot of the current problems that we're facing, that your nation is facing, from the government and corporations that want to drill and take, patent seeds and land. Culturally, Jake, what are the challenges that your people are facing today?
I think the one thing that's affecting us the most, which some people are starting to take notice of, what I mentioned earlier, was climate change. That's going to play a big factor in us reclaiming those old ways, because that's going to help us out in the end. Electricity is going to go out, but if we know how to make, chop down trees, split wood, and start a fire, that's going to be more resourceful than having a 401k, 20, 25 years from now.
Right.
And so, really, a lot of times people push away native cultures until they need us, for us to reteach them how to live again. We're the ones that saved the Pilgrims, showed them how to make food, because they were, dying off, and we showed them, how to survive. Yeah. And so that's what a lot of things we're dealing with now. We mentioned another struggle we have to deal with is the McGirt ruling. We have a governor right now who's trying to disestablish that, or that whole McGirt ruling, and the former attorney general of the state. They're trying to undo that as much as possible, because they're I guess he doesn't feel the tribe should run their own territories per se. Even though this governor is some quote-unquote Cherokee, he called himself. And so that's another one, is one for our next generation, is to learn our treaties and learn about inherent sovereignty, learn about that kind of stuff. That's going to play a big role. And I try to teach people about this stuff, the right ways, about being humble, and respecting one another and not provide for yourself but other people. I have a rule when I'm teaching people because in my job, I'm trying to outreach and try to get my message across to as much people as possible. So I have a rule of don't pay me back. I don't want no money for whatever I'm teaching you. What I taught you, tell it to somebody else. That's paying me back.
Pay it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, and I don't really value money as much as I do changing people's lives.
Absolutely.
But like I said, back to what I was talking about, it even goes further beyond that, talking about sustainability. We're dealing with even disease to this day, heart disease, diabetes, eating fried foods. That's not part of our natural, ingredient.
It's not even food.
Yeah.
A lot of it is not even food.
Yeah, no, a lot of people, when they think of native food, they think of fried bread or Indian tacos.
Right.
That was actually commodities. That's what we call survival food. That's what they made during those harsh times on the reservations, because people were withholding rations, giving us raw or rotten meat, and so they'd come up with something, so they made a fried bread, that kind of stuff. So that's really a survival food. It's not a sustainable food. So teach people how to do that, how to take care of themselves, and also take care of people around you, and be mindful of your surroundings. Don't be wasteful or take more than what you need. Just take what you can get by. One of my good friends is a Cherokee. He's a bow maker, and he kind of changed how I thought about food. Mm-hmm. I thought we were talking about bow hunting, and I said, a lot of times people when they go out hunting, they want to get the biggest buck, and for us, we're more of an opportunistic hunter. Whatever the creator puts out in front of us, that's what we get. We're not going to be greedy and get the biggest one. So that kind of changed people's views of. Oh my bad. And so, changing those views of not thinking of yourself as the center of the universe.
Yeah.
But we all work in the system.
They don't understand the circle.
Yeah.
And it's also they don't understand that killing the biggest buck, you are ruining that line, that gene pool completely. When they go kill the biggest lion, that size lion or that with that ferociousness or that personality will not be passed on. Okay, killing the biggest buck, you're just destroying the gene pool of that species, and it's so selfish and so single-minded that you almost have horse blinds to the whole world, and you're just only seeing what you want, not the rest of it.
Yeah. So that I said that we did an Earth Day recently for our department, and it's actually been I think it might have been the first time we've done that. Not just for our department. I don't know if it might have been the first time for the nation to do that, to acknowledge giving back to the land. So they planted some fruit trees, and they even go, talking about food sovereignty. Any tribe that we talk about these other tribes that have these big casinos that they bring in millions of dollars every year, and we're not like that. We're kind of more conservative in a way that we like to retain most of the traditional knowledge and it'd be good to find a balance.
Right.
But I think to me it's more important to acknowledge that food sovereignty and sustainability, and to where, we're talking about these casinos that bring in millions of dollars, but if this nation can't provide for the people with an adequate nutritional source of food, how rich are they? You gotta really think about that.
Right, yeah, that's a very good point.
So how rich can a nation be if they can't provide for the people in a healthy way?
Well, you also have to think about how much food we throw out just to stabilize the market. 1/3 of American farmers are paid every year not to grow food, while there's people around the world and in our own country, are going hungry. Farmers are paid not to grow food because it will bring the prices up or bring the prices too low, and corporations won't make money. I mean, if you just think about that for a second, that is ridiculous. You are letting people go hungry and die so you can make a few more bucks.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to me, but people are making millions off of it. Thank you for talking about the food thing. I want to address another issue. We discussed many challenges you guys are facing today. You mentioned something earlier that one of the greatest challenges is that how Native women are treated. I stand corrected based on all my arguments because I've said multiple times that I don't think the biggest problem facing Native Americans is a little girl dressing up as Pocahontas. You feel differently. I understand that. And you have valid reasons for feeling that. I'm not if you ever read Wind River or saw the movie Wind River, which is horrific. It is very well portrayed about what the situation is in a lot of these reservations.
That movie Wind River, and there's a movie I did I did a movie 4 years ago. It's called The Bygone.
Okay.
Here in Oklahoma, it's about the same exact subject about the missing murdered Indigenous women and how the tragedies of it. Because a lot of people don't really think about that. It's not really talked about because we have such a small community, and all these people are going to hear our voices.
Yeah.
And so to put it out there on a big media platform, I think it's still on Netflix right now, I believe.
Bygone?
Yeah.
I will check it out.
Bygone.
The Bygone.
Yeah, it's called The Bygone. Graham Phillips was the director, and we filmed it here in Oklahoma.
We'll add that to our movie thing. What we do is that we actually what we're reading, what we're learning, if articles reading, we put up on our site. And okay, hey, this is what we're watching, this is what we're reading, because it's a learning experience. Everything that we're going through, we want our audience to follow. So that will go up on our site 100%, and I'll check it out. But yeah, speaking of the topic, what do you suggest the solution is? What, outside of just more exposure about the topic, what can be done? What are you guys doing about the atrocities and about the ignorance of what's happening to Native women?
So my solutions are, one, teaching the public about this, making them more aware of it, because it's such an epidemic of that in our communities. But on our side is to, one, teach our men to respect our women, and also teach our women how to defend themselves. Go back to, like I said, going back to the natural way of life. And so, respecting one another, that's the main aspect, is to get back to that. And
women traditions.
Yeah, not treat women as objects or.
Do you think that is more of a Western thing that has been imposed?
Yeah.
Or, imposed may not be the correct word, but in a sense, initially imposed, but now just as a part of the mainstream culture that is just adapted? Do you think that's where that originates from?
Yeah, absolutely.
What can you do about that? Because I think that was also your concerns earlier, that the young people are coming in and trying to changing, and maybe not with a bad heart about it, but changing the older traditions.
Yeah, they're just misinterpreting it.
Yeah,
It's about respect, Of course, our women, in traditional times, more traditional times, then they had a certain role that they played, but their voice wasn't at council level, but the understanding was that their brothers and their uncles or fathers or grandfathers, they could share their views with them, and then they could, bring that to a council where decisions were made. But the women themselves didn't sit in council, But like I said, they had the respect, for who they were. They were, revered, because they were bringers of life. They brought life into the world, and so they had that respect there, just that alone. And now with those things like Jake was talking about, that's been going on for a number of years. And only now, because people started protesting, and bringing those issues out to the forefront, that's happening, with our indigenous women, then, it's being recognized more and more. They can't hide from it anymore. So there's been, some steps in that area, laws passed, to recognize those things, to set up task force and stuff. So there are some positive things that are coming about now to try to rectify that, But like I said before, it was going like it wasn't happening, like it was unnoticed, And even now, with young Native American men, are being killed more often, by police than any others, by population-wise, And that's basically ignored. We as indigenous peoples, have pretty much been ignored. I think they wanted us to go away, you know, because every time they see us, then they're reminded of what their ancestors did, you know, and how they've treated us, you know, in today's society.
It's funny, I mean, I can draw a parallel to this. Yesterday when I was at Little Rock, Arkansas at Central High, there was a couple of stories about the students, how they were just tortured every day by the white students.
Yeah.
But there was one side of the story where these black kids they threw food at them, they wrote horrible things on them, they said horrible things at them, they beat them up. But then there was they changed their strategy for one girl particularly, that when she came into school, they just ignored her. So for 4 years in high school, she just didn't exist to them. Did not speak to her, did not look at her. Almost like, okay, what we did in our past, we're not acknowledging it, but we're not acknowledging you either.
Yeah.
And she said that it was just as horrible. It is as if she didn't exist.
Yeah.
What is happening to her didn't matter.
Yeah.
And when you were saying this, it made me think of her story. Is that you guys are right here? These things are happening. There's struggles, there's challenges, but there's also good things happening.
Yeah.
But you're being ignored, just completely looking the other way. And perhaps you're right that they're trying to forget what they've done or ignore what they've done, and one day will, you know, go away. But you guys are right here; it's not going away.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you're talking about this and, you know, bringing this
you
about
know,
the public.
that's what I was saying. You know, in the 70s, the mid 70s, you know, when the American Indian movement came about. Then, you know, a lot of tribes were set for termination because we were basically being ignored at that time. You know, young men, you know, they had no real self-esteem. You know, they were kind of lost in between two worlds. You know, that native world and then, you know, this other world, this European
Not having an
world.
identity.
You know, yeah, and so whenever those things came about, you know, and a couple of courthouses got burnt, you know, and main media and the BIA in Washington, D.C., you know, was occupied for a certain amount of time. Then that brought world attention, you know, and, you know, not only for indigenous peoples, but for the black man too, with the Black Panthers, you know, and all of those things were going on at the same time, late 60s and early 70s. And so that counter-revolution at that time, you know, it started bringing notice as to what was going on, you know, and that's still going on today. And we know that we can't go out and burn buildings anymore, you know,
Right.
and, you know, to bring awareness to, you know, our problems, you know. But, you know, there's social media open the door for that, you know, too.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
if a lot of people are coming out, you know, and they're coming out with truth, you know, as to what happened and what they say can be backed up, then that's where it's at. You know, those things are going to bring change, bringing awareness, you know, to those problems and stuff that it didn't just happen overnight, you know, so it's not going to go away overnight.
Right.
But, you know, that's why we have to have strong people to continue to stand up for those rights, you know, those basic human rights.
And I would end on that, except I have one last question. Prior to me deciding to do this, traveling to Native American reservations and talking to you guys, multiple people have told me, don't go to the Indian reservations. It's like drugs, the alcoholism, crimes, all these bad things. And I'm like, yeah, like I'll go see it for myself. And some people have warned me about it, and it's like you're always the guy who would do something like this, but be careful. You guys seem like lovely people. I'm not seeing many drugs or alcoholism, but I'm sure those are elements that plague every society, every town. What would you say to those people? What would you say to those people who have never stepped foot here and are spreading these words and saying, warning others to not show up here?
One thing, when you were saying that came to mind. We're warned about the same things about don't go to New York, don't go to Chicago, don't go to Washington, D.C.,
Right.
and a lot of these major, cities and stuff, because, there's nothing but drugs and alcohol,
Right.
I've been to D.C., a number of times, with tribal business over the years, and to me, I didn't witness those kind of things,
Right.
that was going on, but I knew they went on, there and
Sure.
stuff by the news. But what was most surprising to me is that I didn't see the birds like I see around here. You know, when I walked the streets, you know, in the Capitol and those areas, and I didn't hear birds, you know, chirping in the trees. I didn't see animals running, and I mean domesticated animals, cats, dogs. I didn't see nothing like that, you know. And I was thinking, man, this is a weird place to be, and it kind of made me feel. I felt kind of like there was something in the air that I needed to get away from, you know.
Also missing.
And I thought about that, you know. I thought about the decisions that's been made here by the people, you know, that were evil. Those were evil things, you know, that came from here, where the decisions were made to do things to other people in the world, you know. And so to me, I was thinking there's got to be a bad force, a negative force here, a strong negative force, and I felt that. And when I would come home, you know, I'd come back here, then to me I had to take a walk in the woods, you know, to ground myself again, you know, to be around the trees, you know, to hear the birds and see the animals, you know. And to me that was a grounding sense to me, you know, relaxing. But like I said, you know, we were told about those other, you know, big cities and stuff, you know, not to go there, you know, because of those things, you know. And of course those things happen in reservations, you know, and stuff. Yeah, because of assimilation.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of those, you know, our people, you know, they're lost out there. You know, they feel worthless because there's no job opportunities, and they feel that it's their responsibility to provide for their families, and they have no means to do that. But you know, there's means to escape that, you know, through alcoholism or drugs or something like that, and they tend to go that way, you know. And so, you know, to me, that's why we have to. You know, we have to do what we can, you know, to provide those opportunities for them, to try to bring them out of that, you know, that trauma that, you know, that has passed down from generation to generation, you know, from those boarding schools, those residential schools, those kind of things that the European nation has done to our people, you know. It caused a trauma that still ripples down to us today, you know, and it's a struggle to get out of that, you know, but that's a struggle that we're all going to have to deal with, you know.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I know that I wanted to come here and speak with you guys in person, but I do not want the conversation to end here. I can speak with you guys all day, but of course we have limited time. But would you guys be okay with, you know, us picking up a conversation down the line? I want to find out about your next Earth Day, whether we can meet virtually. I mean, right now, as you said, social media opens up so many doors.
Right.
The internet opens up so many doors. Would you guys be okay with doing another one with us?
Yeah,
And
sure.
actually, I want to stay in the loop of what's going on.
Yeah.
I want to know that you seem to be doing big, good, positive things for your community. I want to share that. So, you know, it would be great for us to stay connected. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, like I said, it's, you know, it's a pleasure for me to share those things because that's part of it. You know, to me, that's my part of doing something. You know, is to help expose those things, you know, that's happened to us, and also, you know, the positive things and moving forward. You know.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.